Hello, everybody. Welcome to one of the two massive clades of kind of the core asterids, the Lamiids group. And if you love cool flowers, biodiversity, plant pollinator interaction stories, this might just be the broader clade for you. There's quite a few families listed. Don't be intimidated. We're kind of going to teach the Orobanchaceae, Plantaginaceae, and Scrofulariaceae as one. So here's the phylogeny of the Lamiids. And we are really only looking at three different orders. The Lamiales, or the mint order, with Lamiaceae and the three that we talked about. Solanales with Solanaceae, the tomato family. Gentianales with gentians, Apostolacy, including milkweeds, and Rubiaceae, the coffee family. And finally, the Boraginales with the Boraginaceae. And as I look at the things we're not covering, I have to admit to you that the three orders we're not covering, I have absolutely no idea what any of them are. I should look them up. That's so crazy. Looking within the orders at stuff we're not covering, there's so many cool Lamiales, certainly in the tropics, as well as some in the temperate zones here. Big in the tropics would be like the Acanthaceae, Gesneriads, the African violet group, Oleaceae, the olives. In some of the other orders, what do I like? Convolvulaceae and the Solanaceae, that would be the morning glories, which we're not really covering. And yes, let's begin our journey. Okay, so we're going to start with the Gentianales. And this is a rather large group, mostly because of two dominant families, Rubiaceae, or the coffee family, and Apostolacy, or the milkweeds. Okay, what are some things that this order shares? Well, there's a fun thing called estivation, which is like how the petals are kind of arranged in bud. And all of Gentianales shares this kind of like one side tucked in, one side tucked out, very delightful spiral, which is called contort corolla estivation. I like the word quincunculo. You could use that in a sentence. That would be amazing. Okay, so first family, the gentian family, the Gentianaceae. This is found all over the world. There's some really cool gentian groups in New Zealand. There's really cool gentians in mainland Africa and Madagascar, as well as throughout South America. In the tropics, they can be trees, but in our neck of the woods, they're mostly going to be herbs. There are some mycotrophs. That's going to be a theme of the day, plants that actually consume fixed carbon from fungi. Okay, this group shares having opposite leaves, and they are glabrous, lacking hairs. Pretty wild, right? In the family, they share being right contorted. So you see that the right side is tucked in, the left side's out. So that spiraling twist is shared by all members of the Gentianaceae. Okay, this whole group, the Lamiids, is where we're really going to see consistently those key asterid features, right? So the flowers are going to have a base count of 4s or 5s. They're not going to have tons of members of any whorl at all. So in this case, you have the same number of stamen as petals. And the petals and the stamen are actually fused to each other. That's what the line under corolla and androaceae means. The pistil is superior and it's made of 2 carpels. And there is what's called parietal placentation as opposed to septicidal. So the septum is what divides the carpels. And so a septicidal capsule opens along the septum. Parietal placentation, like we see here, opens 90 degrees to the septum. So it's a capsular fruit, dry, and it opens at maturity. And you can see here the seeds inside of it. There are so many beautiful wildflowers in this group. This group does some of the deepest, truest, like blues and purples. Mostly these are going to be late summer, autumn bloomers, including some of the very last bloomers besides the Asteraceae in Colorado. At many different elevations, grasslands to tundra, they're just absolute joys to see. So here's 3 genera that live in Colorado: Gentiana, Gentianopsis, and Gentianella. And you can see that they differ in merosity, which you can see in these photos, whether there is a little plate or a little extra fringe here between each petal lobe, so the 5 main lobes, and then a little plate, whether the petals have fringes or whether they lack those features. But my favorite species of gentian, as cute as that all was, is the genus Frasera, known as elkweed or green gentian. Okay, so the reason I love this so much is this is a plant that is long-lived, so it's not an annual, but it is semiparous, which is one of my great research things that I love to study. So things that live and grow and then sexually reproduce once and then afterwards die down to the ground are so fascinating to evolutionary biologists. Salmon do it, cicadas do it, and so does this gentian. So you will see kind of in the high country these like basal rosettes of large leaves, and they live for many years as that. And then potentially once they reach a critical size or if critical reserves built up or certain weather conditions, I'm not actually sure, and I know there's been long-term studies on this, you will get the bolting event. So a massive inflorescence. You can see it's pretty large here. Lots and lots of flowers, and it dies afterwards. So it has, unlike the others, a very open, broad kind of flower, and it's greenish. Love these guys. Okay, now we move on to the Apostolacy or the milkweeds. This is a pretty species-rich group around the world. Lots of tropical trees, vines, and some herbs, especially in the temperate regions. Again, all with opposite leaves. Pachypodium here has these beautiful kind of tropical looking flowers, and it has this giant bulbous base where it's actually storing space for ant colonies in it. So it's one of these that has these cool ant mutualisms from the tropics. And here's a vining member from the tropics as well. Some other ones that are really crazy. A lot of times we have this kind of understory weed in many areas. Vinca minor, also known as periwinkle. I've seen it on campus. It's around, but it has really beautiful flowers. This is yet another group that has kind of convergently evolved the exact same body form as cactus and euphorbia. We have some in the greenhouse. I'll have to bring them down. They look kind of bumpy and awkward, like a lame euphorbia, but when they flower, they're so darn cool. And once I teach you about their flowers, you would like, oh, I can kind of see it. Perhaps then the most beloved group are going to be the milkweeds that we're going to talk about a lot, which usually are all around our building, and they're just now coming up here in the spring. Some other really important things to know about this family are all of the secondary compounds that it includes. This is a group that you can often tell vegetatively by tearing a little bit of leaf, and out will come a milky latex. If any of you have played around with a milkweed, you've seen this. Now, these can be very irritating compounds to get on your hands, etc. They're full of all different kinds of glycosides and other really interesting, if potentially toxic, if potentially amazing secondary compounds. So probably the most important is this periwinkle, which looks like the vinca that we have, but this is a species native to Madagascar. And it has been a critical plant in the fight against breast cancer. Some really important medicines have been derived from it. The curare vine of South America, which is involved in a lot of shamanistic and, important ritual and now kind of like tourism for hallucinogens. That's a very important component of some of those practices. And then probably you are aware of the coevolutionary story between the genus Asclepius, or the milkweed, and the monarch butterfly that's able to bioaccumulate the cardiac glycosides that the plant produces and use it as its own defense. So lots of arms races with animals going on in this group that have been co-opted by people for various things, and animals. Okay. So it used to be that the milkweeds were in their own family, the Asclepiadaceae. But, kind of one of the themes of this class is that molecular systematics changes names. So now the Asclepiadaceae is clearly embedded within the rest of the Apostolaceae. So we don't talk about the Asclepiadaceae anymore. It is now the Asclepiadoideae subfamily. Yes. Now we're going to see some really amazing evolutionary innovations of the corolla as we evolve towards the milkweed form. You could kind of argue that milkweeds are about as cool as orchids. But in general, what are the features that all milkweeds share? Well, it's going to look a lot like gentians, but their base numbers are 5, never 4. Similarly, you get fusion between the corolla and the androecium. And now the perianth is left contorted as opposed to right contorted. Similarly, there's going to be carpels, but they're not fused together. They form individual follicles. So you can see here, these two carpels are about to burst apart. And here are the early follicles on dogbane, which we're going to talk about. Okay, one cool thing we see starting to evolve in this group is pollen presentation. So that's kind of a theme throughout the asterids, is as opposed to just slitting open your anthers and putting them out there and letting whatever come and receive the pollen, various asterids have evolved secondary pollen presentation, in which the flower itself, the growth and development of the flower, packages and moves the pollen around. So in this case, this is like an early developing alamandra flower. Here is going to be the style. Well, here's the style, and then here's the stigma here. And as it grows up, it's going to be going right under kind of a umbrella of the stamen. And at that point in time, they are going to dehiss and coat the outside of its own stigma. And then as it pushes up past that, it presents its own pollen to others. And so if you look at the top down on a flower like this, there's kind of, it almost looks like it's sealed off. So this is called connivent, where the tops of the stamen are kind of almost sealed or connected all the way around. And then that plunger is going to push right up through the middle of that. Now, there's all sorts of interesting things one could study about. Is it self-compatible? Isn't it just pollinating itself? Or does it not allow that to happen and require pollen to be removed prior to the female function commencing? I study another group of asterids that does secondary pollen presentation. And I can tell you there's a time lag in terms of days between when the male function happens and hopefully the pollen is then removed, and then when the female function commences. Okay, so now let's talk about the true milkweeds, in which we have an inferior ovary, okay? And we're gonna have a highly modified, weird looking flower. It looks like it's got like 5 lobster claws and kind of a skirt down here. What on earth is going on with a milkweed flower? Well, we're gonna walk through this. What we're gonna see is fusion of the stamens to each other as well as to the style to create a male and female structure called the gynostegium. It is roughly analogous to the column of the Orchidaceae. Very similar to what's happening in the Orchidaceae, as a packing of all pollen from a flower into two pollinia that are hooked together. And then you're going to see how their little hook is moved onto an insect's leg for pollination. These produce tons of seeds with tufts of hair. That's not derived from the style. That's just from the seed coat itself for dispersal via the wind. So milkweed pods, which we have in lab to look at. Okay, so now let's walk through this crazy structure. So here's like an old-timey drawing of all this that I really, really love, and an actual dissection. Okay, so this is a side view in of this structure that's kind of actinomorphic when looked down from the top. Okay, we have two carpels that are slightly fused at the top, but are generally pretty free. There are sepals and petals down below that are both pretty petaloid, though there's a lot of variation in this group, but they're like folded down like a skirt. Now we're considering these lobster claws that have kind of two different portions. The whole set of lobster claws here, which are light pink, is called the corona. Some of you have seen corona before when we were looking at the interior of a daffodil, which was a corona derived from the base of the stamen, not the petals or the sepals. Okay, the two regions of the corona are the outer hood and then the crest. And there's been lots of studies, including what I just reread today, all about like, what is the corona, right? Corona means crown. We all know that, Lord knows. But it's like a fifth whorl of the flower. And you're like, that doesn't happen. You said there were always four whorls. So botanists have really considered, well, what does this derive from? Is it from the petals? Is it from the stamen? What's going on? And there's actually kind of two different forms of it. One derived from the petals, one derived from the stamen. This is probably the one that's derived from the stamen. So think of this as like the bottom of the filaments. I don't know what they did. They got supercharged and made this really crazy structure that can be very nectar rich to coerce very specific pollinators. Okay, under the corona then is this giant kind of lump called the gynostegium, which is going to be, again, the stamen all fused around a central kind of style region. Okay. The anther regions of the stamen produce pollinia or pollen masses. Now look how cute. This over here is an insect's foot that is catching the center, and usually there's like a little black thing here, and just pulls it out, just like you're pulling keys out of your purse. It just pulls this whole thing out, and it's tucked into the center of this gynostegium. The whole thing on the gynostegium, it really reminds me of like, I don't know, a vending machine. And there's stuff that comes out and stuff that gets put in, like coins in a slot. So there's also going to be slots in the side. Okay, so here's actually a pollinia being pulled out. And it has a similar kind of two-wing thing that we saw in Orchidaceae, for those of you who saw it. Okay, so here's the adorable insect removing the pollinia. And when it goes to another flower, it inserts it into literally a slot. It reminds me of like putting, again, a coin into a vending machine. This thing just has to go into this very specific stigmatic cleft to adhere. This is crazy. Apparently it works very well. There's many species of milkweeds worldwide. It's pretty darn risky. The chances of that happening seem pretty low. So what you see is that from a milkweed plant, which probably had dozens of flowers, maybe only one or a couple follicles, which again is a one carpellate splitting open fruit, will be produced. So I've seen this for many years in front of Barnes Olin with all of our milkweeds. Now, it could be that we're lacking pollinators. I see them frequented by bees a lot, not so much monarchs where we are. But I see really relatively low fruit set. So it's a pretty random encounter. Okay, and then again, here's the beautiful follicle. And there's nothing so beautiful as a fresh milkweed follicle opening up, and the seeds are lying in there just so with their hairs tucked into the middle. Okay, two other groups. Actually, let me go back to the giant milkweeds and then we'll go back to the other groups. So this is a fun picture from a publication about milkweed diversity. So you can see some of the diversity found throughout the world. It's particularly species rich in the American West. The global botanist who's in charge of this group, he's at Oklahoma State. He's a really cool guy. I just love these flowers. They're so fascinating to look at. The most common one, especially like the one we have by the building, is Asclepias speciosa. The bright orange one, butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. And there's some wetland specialists, all kinds of different things. They are not in the alpine. They're more plains and lower elevation. I wanted to tell you about this absolutely amazing brand new book that just came out, Iwigara, by Enrique Salmon, who is an indigenous author. And he talks through lots of different species of plants that are used by various indigenous people throughout the United States. So he talked about milkweeds themselves. Various indigenous communities actually extract the latex itself and use it as a snuff. And they also use it as like a deworming treatment. So we see that a lot, that people use plants to rid themselves of insects, which makes sense, or other parasites, because that's often why those compounds evolved in the first place. Apparently the young stems are edible. I'm suspicious, but that's what they said. And all that fluffy down from the fruits can be used for stuffing of pillows, mattresses, whatever, and for fiber. Okay, so now to the other genus I'd like you to know, Opossum. Here's a couple different species that we have in Colorado. Opossum androsaemifolium, the spreading dogbane, has these like much bigger kind of bell flowers. They don't have all the crazy corona stuff and gynostegium so much going on like the Asclepias group. Here's Opossum cannabum with much tinier flowers. This is known as Indian hemp. It has a great number of uses by indigenous communities, primarily for fiber. So this makes great, strong nets. Tribes that use salmon a lot make their nets out of this, as well as use it medicinally. Okay. Moving right along to the coffee family. Thank goodness. Ooh, love the coffee family. Huge, 10,000 plus species. Again, the vast majority are in the tropics, not so much here. Here we really only have one genus, though there's a few occasions of other things, including this Houstonia here. Cinchona, quinine, very important. Lots of different things. You've got trees, shrubs, lianas, herbs. Pretty much everything exists in the Rubiaceae, as well as lots of drugs. Okay, the key feature, this is a really good plant family to learn vegetatively. It's another one with opposite leaves. Many times they appear whorled with many leaves coming out from one node. And what those whorls are interpetular stipules. So stipules that are kind of rotated out from where the petioles are. So in the case of this Gallium, which is like the key genus to know here in Colorado, also known as bedstraw, you have true leaves and then a bunch of foliose stipules. So it looks like it has like 10 leaves. Similar themes to what we've seen before, 4 or 5 meros, 4 especially in the temperate. So what we're going to see, Gallium is going to be 4 meros. Tends to be tiny flowers in clusters. It is epigynous in its entirety. It's the only one in the gentianales as so. And the fruit is usually a 2-seeded drupe. Okay. All right, so the only thing you needed to know in Rubiaceae was Gallium, the bedstraws, which have tiny light white flowers and those interpetular stipules. Bedstraw, I forgot to make a slide about that. Sorry. It's like a creeping, clambering herb in the forest understory. There's quite a few species of it. And yes, it has been used to stuff mattresses. Okay. The order Solanaceae. Again, pretty species rich as an order. Two main groups, Solanaceae, which we're going to cover, the nightshade or tomato family, and Convolvulaceae, the morning glories. I debated teaching this one. I don't like them. They're really nasty weeds out here, though they are quite charming. I'm sure we'll see them. They're really showing nicely all that fusion of the Asteraceae. Okay, what unites the Solanaceae? They lack iridoids, which are found elsewhere in the asterids. Now we actually have an alternate leaved group, and the corolla is what's called plicate in bud, which is fan folded. So if you've ever, like a kid folding paper to make a fan, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Think like that. Oftentimes the calyx is persistent in fruit. So when we talk about tomatillo, think of a tomato with a little cap on it, right? The calyx persists. It doesn't fall off. Okay. So again, alternate leaved. Another thing they share is having a cyme or a dichasium inflorescence. Here's two very important sources of drugs, Nicotiana, tobacco. Huge role ethnobotanically in indigenous cultures, though domesticated in South America, brought up to North America pretty early on, as well as in the history of colonialization, enslavement, etc., of the United States. Brugmansia on the left is angel trumpet. And maybe I'll tell you someday the story about my undergraduate study abroad trip to Brazil, in which students tried to hallucinate with it. Don't do that. They did. At any rate, there's lots of crazy chemicals in lots of Solanaceae, and you can hurt yourself with them. Yes? Okay. A 5-Maris family for sure, with tons of fusion, right? Fused calyx, fused corolla, corolla fused to androecium. They all share having axial placentation. So here is a bell pepper cut through like the stem would be behind you. And you can see all of the seeds embedded in the center here, right? And the formal term for the fruit of Solanaceae is a berry. So yes, a tomato is a fruit. It is a berry. And this is another group in which we have buzz pollination, which is very important. So we talked about the Ericaceae has this, Solanaceae has it as well. So if you're looking right at the tips of these stamen, they'll never split open, but maybe you can envision little tiny holes right here. And if you had the right frequency of wings, you could shake some pollen out of there. Certainly peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, tomatillos, potatoes, which is not included. Critical, very important family globally. We talked about some of these guys. I like to talk about Atropa belladonna, which causes eye dilation. If you've ever been to the optometrist and had your eyes dilated and turned all big, it comes from a derivation of this plant, which was used by prostitutes to make their eyes look enticing. And then Datura, the Jimson weed, which is found in Colorado, particularly escaped from cultivation. And again, be very careful if you experiment with any of these plants. It is hallucinogenic. You really should know what you're doing, or just leave well enough alone. We live in a weed legal state, folks. Be content. But at any rate, here is the Jimson weed. Big, beautiful, white, bell-shaped flowers, spiky fruits. Don't try it. Okay. The calyx persistent, right? So we'll talk about tomatillo, but here's the Japanese lantern, which is puffed up and sealed around the fruit. And here is a genus to know, Physalis, which is also, which the tomatillo is in, as well as some much lesser known species. Common name is ground cherry. And you'll see them forming those little lanterns, which are so charming, and a very classic Solanaceae flower. There's quite a lot of species diversity here in Colorado, and there's a graduate student at CU Boulder working on the taxonomy and phylogeny of this group. And then the other genus to know is Solanum itself, which is huge globally, potatoes in it, big in South America. We have a few species here, including some weedy ones. Here's Solanum triflorum, the cutleaf nightshade. And boy, don't its little berries look just like an immature tomato? Now, again, be very cautious if you try to do anything with the Solanaceae other than domesticated ones in the grocery store. Indigenous herbalists absolutely make all kinds of different medicines from this, but without knowing what you're doing, you could poison yourself with an unknown Solanaceae or a poorly prepared one. Finally, we move to the Lamiaceae. This is a very big order, 23,000 plus species, or 12% of all eudicots. The big one, mints, the Lamiaceae itself. Zygomorphy, the evolution of very strong zygomorphy, has been found to coincide with increased rates of speciation and decreased rates of extinction. And this group has it in spades. These now have the iridoids back. These are opposite leaves for the most part, and strongly zygomorphic or bilabiate two-lipped flowers common. We're going to see drops in stamen numbers. 4 stamens is common. We'll see some go down to 2. Okay, first family, the Boraginaceae or the borages. Not actinomorphic or not zygomorphic yet. This is a very hairy plant group. One of the key ways to know it is what's called a scorpioid cyme inflorescence. So it's like a partial cyme and it curls around like a scorpion's tail. That always helps me to find it. Here's one of our absolute most beloved plants, the alpine forget-me-not, the purest sky blue with a little yellow center, so cute, Erytricum nanum. Okay, 5s, 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 again, corolla and androecium feuds. A key feature here, and we'll see it in Lamiaceae as well, is what's called a gynobasic style. So you see the style comes right out from the center around which the fruits cluster. So 4 nutlets, 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's often kind of a receptacle dish. So it looks like it's just jammed in the center of that whole thing. Sometimes we see differential heights of the stigma and the anthers. So cool breeding systems going on in here to maybe promote outcrossing, high female, low male, high male, low female. These can probably not self, and you would benefit from cross-pollination between these 2 types. The genus Lithospermum is a beautiful yellow borage. So we see lots of fusion. This is a very actinomorphic group. A couple of our local species here, kind of late spring, early summer. Beloved Mertensia, or the bluebells, our local one near Colorado Springs, Lanceolata, the prairie. There's many other species as we move up into the alpine and in Old World as well. Again, this very sky blue color, common. And then 2 large and really tricky genera. So it's not all just pretty beloved little wildflowers. These are really tough. They're also very important. So again, kind of like how Fabaceae has its Astragalus and Oxytropis, 2 large and challenging genera, Boraginaceae has 2 large and challenging genera, Cryptantha and Oriocaria. Once you learn kind of a borage flower look, you start to just kind of see them in there, but they can get really darn tiny. Many of them are very, very, very hairy. In general, though, Cryptantha are annuals lacking a basal rosette of leaves, and Oriocaria are biennials or perennials with larger flowers in general, basal leaves, and a taproot. Okay, the Lamiaceae, 7,000 plus species, mostly herbs, sometimes shrubs and trees. Found in Mediterranean climate regions at high species number. So again, anywhere where you get hot summers, rainy winters. So California in particular, the California floristic province is the hotspot in the United States for this, as well as the true Mediterranean region of Europe, and elsewhere, South Africa, Australia, etc. Strongly aromatic group, and usually very pleasant scents. So many of our culinary herbs come from this group. Square stems, opposite leaves. Nice when that works out just so. The flowers are often in tight little clusters, verticils, kind of tucked into the stem right at nodes. We often see that. Not entirely, though. This family's old name, Labiatae, means two-lipped or bilabiate, and that is indeed what the flowers are. They sort of have this dragon head look to them. The stamens are 4, like we see here in Clerodendrum. So we have a 5-merous flower, but we're going to drop it down to 4 stamens. We will see how Salvia jettisons it down to 2. So talk about reduction and fusion. This also has a gynobasic style. So here are the 4 nutlet fruits, and the style would come right out of the middle of that. Here's 4 nutlets as well. So nutlets are tiny nuts, indehiscent dry fruits. These ones are too immature. They're not black yet. Okay, so another one of these families where we have lots of invasives as well as lots of high quality natives. So here is field mint, the true mint we have in Colorado. Here is catnip, which is kind of weedy that moves around. One of my favorite, the wild bergamot with these very bilabiate large flowers. Another genus to know is Salvia. Huge, almost 1,000 species worldwide. My PhD advisor works on this with a lot of students I went to graduate school with. Here's a recent paper that they came out with. And here are some dissected out salvia flowers. So what happens with salvia, we actually have 2 stamens. So 2 are aborted early in development. And then each stamen is super weird. So usually you'd have multiple anther sacs close together in a traditional stamen. Well, what happens here is that only one of those sacs really forms and is fertile. The other one kind of swings down and forms a little push pad. And there's like a long bit of space between them. So what's going to happen is a pollinator enters into that bilabiate. And this is really appealing to pollinators that like to sit while they feed, especially bees, wasps, etc. So it goes in there and it's going low to access the nectar with its long tongue towards the back. Its head hits the push part, the sterile part of the anther, and then it's like a lever. It swings down and smacks it on the back, the fertile portion of the stamen. So you can see here's like a really nice example of that. You can see some of the weird variation on this. And they were looking at kind of classic bee, hummingbird, other types of bird coevolutions with flowers throughout the family. So this is a great one for coevolution with pollinator studies. And finally, the quote unquote Scrofulariaceae. Okay, I was taught it as one thing. Now it's a hot mess. So it's kind of like Liliaceae in that this group has been split up in the era of molecular systematics. And now there's lots of families, and some of them are just not morphologically distinctive. So what's going on here? Okay, this group could kind of have everything. It could be alternate or opposite leaved, round stems, or some squarish stems. It does have a terminal style with many seeds and capsular fruits. So as opposed to the 4 nutlet thing, it definitely has capsular fruits. So it's kind of like a mint, kind of, with often round stems, capsular fruits with lots and lots of seeds and not a gynobasic style. So that's nice, but it's not a thing. It's this suite of characters is kind of retained and evolves in many different groups. So I don't think it's even worth learning this floral formula because it's just so variable. So here's an actual phylogeny of this group, and highlighted in pink are some of the families that were formerly placed in Scrofularia as I learned it. So you can see some of them over here are much closer to Lamiaceae that we just learned than others, which are very distant relatives of lots of different things. So it's kind of all over the places. Again, as I had you just say, meh, if you want to learn the former Liliaceae for this class, that's fine. You can learn these things as the former Scrofulariaceae. The genera are good to learn, but the families kind of, ugh. Okay, the three families that are the most important in Colorado, if you want to learn them, are the Orobanchaceae, the Plantagenaceae, and the Scrofulariaceae, now as it is, which is sensu strictu. Orobanks is kind of a thing. The majority, like a kind of a thing, I mean, it is a thing that's supported by molecular evidence. We want to have entities that are also fairly obvious morphologically. And orobanks kind of are. Many of the members lack chlorophyll and are mycotrophs. We also have Hemi parasites, very strongly zygomorphic corollas across this group. We're going to learn Castelleja and Pedicularis. The Plantagenaceae and the Scrofulariaceae, sensu strictu. Oh, geez, I put the same genera down twice. That's terrible. I apologize for that. Scrofulariaceae, we're learning verbascum. I'm so sorry. It's kind of funny I did that because there's really no clear morphological difference between those two families that's consistent in any way, which is kind of frustrating. Okay, so Scrofulariaceae, the one we're learning, verbascum thapsus or mullen. It's pretty tiny, but you think back to all that nomenclature stuff, because the type genus Scrofularia, including the first species described within that group, is in this clade. It retains the name Scrofulariaceae, even though now it's kind of small and unimportant. Verbascum thapsus, our common mullen, is a weedy biennial, so it lives 1-ish years just as a rosette before bolting. It is listed as a noxious weed list C. Okay, now we move to Plantagenaceae, the kind of undistinguishable family. Two important species to learn. I want you to learn the genus Linaria. This is kind of the butter and eggs or toadflax groups. They look like snapdragons. They have this really beautiful flowers, but these are really bad weeds in our region. List B, which is worse than list C. Like, I try and take these out when I can through hand pulling because I'm a fool. It doesn't work. Some nice members of the Plantagenaceae, just for funsies, include the true snapdragon, Antirrhina, which you can dissect, as well as my daughter's namesake, Veronica. Okay, within Plantagenaceae, a wonderful group of plants to know is Penstemon. They don't have a common name in English. It's Penstemon, and there are hundreds of species of this. Strongly bilabiate, high fusion, delightful flowers. And here's some of the diversity here. And I'm showing for you a phylogeny in which the origins of hummingbird are denoted here in red, and everything else is B. And they were looking at kind of speciation rate in bee syndrome versus hummingbird syndrome. And you see actually an uptick in the speciation rate in bee pollinated lineages and a downtick in hummingbird. So in the neotropics, in the Andes in particular, hummingbird pollination is seen as this key driver of speciation. But in very temperate groups like Penstemon, that is not the case. Very exciting. Finally, the worst common name, and I don't know where it came from. I can't even say it. The Orobanchaceae. So this is the one with the crazy parasites. So here are true parasites lacking chlorophyll. You should actually see what happens to their genome. Their chloroplast genome just sheds genes all over the place. Here's Canophilus americana, known as cancer root. That's unfortunate. Tiny, freaky little flowers. You can see that in Colorado. Orobank itself, a couple of different species with kind of these long tubular flowers. So we've seen kind of holoparasitism evolve in the Ericaceae, in the Orobancaceae, as well as in the Orchidaceae. So look closer if you see any of these really weird colored things in the summer. The host plant of Orobanks is a species of Artemisia. So this is one that's not parasitizing fungi, but actually directly parasitizing plants. That absolutely happens in this group. The two nice ones I really want you to look at, which are very delightful Colorado native plants, are Hemi parasites. So they're kind of parasitizing plants around them, but also still photosynthesizing. So they kind of still look like full-blown plants. The elephant heads, pedicularis, with these adorable little flowers that look like elephants. And Castelleja, or the paintbrush group, with really colorful bracts, long, kind of pokey, highly zygomorphic corollas coming out of it. Very cool species-rich group. And I've just found out that the leader of the Orobancaceae scientist community is taking a brand new job at my alma mater, the University of Wyoming, as the head of the herbarium there. And they have a great botany program and great legacy. So check it out. And that is it for now.